Enjoy listening to this and other great podcasts from Jacob's Tent? Want even more content from us? Download the Jacob's Tent app today and gain access to the latest videos, teachings, and exclusive content all in one location. Stay connected and up to date with everything happening in the tent with the Jacob's Tent app, available on the App Store, Google Play, or wherever you find your apps.
In the early morning hours of January 1st, disaster struck as a crazed, radicalized terrorist drove a pickup truck into a crowd gathered in New Orleans for New Year's, killing many and wounding many more. Within hours of this attack, an explosion occurred outside of a Las Vegas hotel. What's going on? Are these things related? And what do these attacks portend for the future? In this episode of the Weekly Scroll, we're going to discuss these things and what the Bible has to say about terror in America.
Welcome to the Weekly Scroll, sharing biblical thoughts on current events. Scroll through today's top headlines with Bill Cloud as he unravels the political and spiritual implications of the world we live in, all through the lens of Scripture. Now, be encouraged, be challenged, and be ready.
Well, welcome to this episode of the Weekly Scroll. The year 2025 has begun, and unfortunately, in America, it began on a frightening and deadly note. In the early morning hours of January 1st, a man identified as Shamsud, I hope I'm saying that right, Shamsuddin Jabbar, drove a pickup truck into a crowd of people at a New Year celebration in New Orleans. At least 15 people were killed, dozens more were injured. The attacker died at the scene after exchanging gunfire with authorities. Jabbar was born in America and was an Army veteran who served as a human resources specialist and information technology specialist, an IT guy, until January of 2015. Following active duty, he served in the Army Reserves as an IT specialist until 2020. And during his tenure, he deployed to Afghanistan. He was awarded a variety of medals throughout his military service, including, get this, a Global War on Terrorism Service Medal. Now, obviously, something happened to alter his mindset because inside the vehicle used to plow down the people gathered on Bourbon Street, authorities discovered additional weapons, including potential improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, and an ISIS flag. Authorities also found other potential IEDs that were located throughout the French Quarter. At one point, authorities thought that this man may have had accomplices, but now they have dismissed that notion. But then there is this other mysterious and very suspicious explosion that occurred outside the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas. The Las Vegas suspect, who has been identified as an active-duty U.S. Army Green Beret, drove a Tesla Cybertruck filled with gasoline, camp fuel containers, and large firework mortars. And this man initiated a blast that he was killed. It injured about 7 other people. Now, this apparent second terror attack has prompted a lot of questions as to whether there was some military connection between these two men. Now, the jury is still out on that, but there are some very interesting connections between these two homegrown terrorists, and maybe in time we'll know a bit more than we do now. Of course, all of this has generated a great deal of media coverage, a lot of alarm, criticism, finger-pointing, and calls for an investigation of those who were responsible for everyone's safety. The incoming border czar, Tom Homan, issued this warning about the state of U.S. national security. This country is in grave danger. We need to secure that border, referring to the southern border. And despite what happened in the last 2 days in Las Vegas and in New Orleans, this administration, referring to the Biden administration, is not stopping. They're still releasing thousands of people every week without proper vetting. All right? So we understand that there's a definite problem with the southern border, but wasn't the New Orleans attacker born in Texas? Yeah, he was. But for decades, the southern border has been an entry point, not only for those people who say they are seeking a better life, but also for those who are seeking to inflict harm on this nation. Over 40 years ago, during the Reagan administration, then CIA Director Bill Casey raised the alarm with President Reagan that among those entering the country illegally at the southern border, there were Islamic operatives and terrorists. In other words, for a very long time, militant people from the East have been infiltrating our populace. And I would add, they have been working very hard to influence the hearts and minds of many. On that note, the brother of the New Orleans attacker said, when speaking of his brother's religious background, that the attack was an example of radicalization, and that's his word. Now, both brothers were raised Christian, but had both converted to Islam. And so the surviving brother said that what he did does not represent Islam. This is more some type of radicalization and not religion. Now, with all due respect to the brother, I'm of the opinion that people like Osama bin Laden, who I believe was a very devout Muslim, would disagree with that particular assessment. And apparently there are other radicals in this nation who see this attack as a justified action. On New Year's Day, a New York City protest that was organized by the Palestinian Youth Movement, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and the People's Forum had hundreds of participants marching in the streets of the Big Apple chanting, "There is only one solution, intifada, revolution," which, by the way, is a revolution of violence. Among other chants, they were saying, "Resistance is glorious, and we will be victorious. We will honor all our martyrs." So in other words, these protesters were seemingly in support of what happened just a few hours before. These protesters also carried signs that read, "Zionism is a cancer," and "End all U.S. aid to Israel." One woman who was among the protesters, wearing a keffiyeh, shouted at counter-protesters, quote, "Go back to Europe." Now, mind you, this was just hours after this murderous attack was carried out in New Orleans against innocent people. Now, decades ago, I remember hearing from multiple sources how the greatest threat to the United States and the West would be, in time, radical Islam. I can remember as far back as the late 70s and early 80s hearing this. In other words, this was long before the attack on the USS Cole. This was a very long time before September 11th and the aftermath of those attacks. And my point, though, is here we are in 2025, homegrown radical Islamists being cheered on by homegrown radicals and anarchists, most likely influenced by those who are not homegrown, but who have infiltrated almost every aspect of our society. And there is a fear that this is just going to continue and will prove perhaps to be not an isolated incident, but is something that will likely inspire others who would want to be terrorists, or it might embolden groups like ISIS to radicalize even more Americans. In fact, according to some retired FBI agents, ISIS is currently under extreme stress. Their very existence is being threatened in Syria and elsewhere. And so it is theorized that in an act of desperation, they might be even more proactive when it comes to promoting their message in an effort to radicalize Westerners, Europeans, and Americans, and then to put them into action. That is to say, to activate any cells that they may have in place. And remember, they've had at least 40 years to put these cells in place. In fact, before he carried out his attack in New Orleans, Jabbar posted several videos on Facebook declaring his support for ISIS and his support for the war against the disbelievers. According to one expert in this field, these Islamic ideologues start out with soft messaging in order to, quote, attract people into their thought process. Very interesting idea. Then links are provided that lead people to additional messages, thus sowing division, distrust of government in, according to this expert, young, impressionable minds. Now, let's contrast this situation that's being described for us here, in other words, what the real threat is, with what the Biden-Harris administration and their philosophical allies have been telling us for years. Joe Biden has repeatedly stressed that the greatest threat facing the U.S. was not Islamic radicals and jihadists, But the greatest threat facing the United States was white supremacy. Even saying that terrorist organizations such as ISIS could not compare to the danger that was posed by white supremacists. In 2021, Biden made this statement. According to the intelligence community, terrorism from white supremacy is the most lethal threat to the homeland today. Not ISIS, not Al-Qaeda, white supremacists. Now, weeks before this statement, Biden said in his State of the Union address, quote, "We won't ignore what our intelligence agencies have determined to be the most lethal terrorist threat to the homeland today. White supremacy is terrorism." Now, I'm not here to defend white supremacist and white terrorist or anything like that. But in my view, advancing this mindset expressed by President Biden in every conceivable way has greatly contributed to why hundreds of protesters can march in the streets of New York City shouting "Intifada revolution" and nobody really cares. And to promote this mindset certainly doesn't dissuade those who are bent on killing as many infidels as possible. So these people who want to be regarded as a shaheed, a martyr, they don't have anything really that would dissuade them from, from advancing this particular agenda. But this mindset that is advanced by President Biden and those who agree with him also reminds me of a very important parable that we find in the Gospels, and that is the parable of the wheat and the tares. I won't take the time to read it, but the parable teaches us that the wheat grows because the good seed, which is the word of God, has been sown in the field, and this produces the sons of the kingdom. The field, of course, is the world. But in the parable, he says that an enemy came and he sowed tares in the midst of the wheat. And the tares were sown not to coexist with the wheat, but to steal, to kill, and to destroy. But how is it that the enemy was able to infiltrate the field and then sow this poisonous and deadly seed among those who were the wheat? It's because those who were responsible to watch over the field, to guard it, weren't paying attention. They let their guard down. And so it's written in Matthew 13, "But while men slept," a very, very important statement. While men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. From the beginning, the Bible teaches us that the adversary's MO is to get into the midst of what is good and then sow something that is deadly. That's what the tares are in the parable. A poisonous thought, an alternative word and ideology that, if it's allowed to remain, will germinate, and then it will sprout, and then it will eventually produce its fruit, and that fruit will render death. And so that's why the adversary was determined to get into the midst of the garden, not just Eden, but in the very midst of the garden, where the tree of life grew. Why? To sow another seed that produced something that had the appearance of being good, but was in reality something that brought about death. In another example, when Nehemiah and the people of Jerusalem were restoring the walls of the beloved city, there was a man called Sanballat, who is referred to as the Horonite. And this is believed to refer to a town that was situated in an area just south of present-day Nablus, which is, if you've kept up with Israeli news, you know the infamy that is attached to the town Nablus. Anyway, Sanballat was considered to be a Samaritan, who, you may recall, were a group of people who had been transplanted by the Assyrian king Sennacherib from their homeland into the land of Israel. Now, think tares being sown amongst the wheat. Sanballat was associated with two other men who were antagonistic toward Nehemiah and the Jews. One of them was Tobiah the Ammonite. They lived across the Jordan. And then there was Geshem the Arabian. But here's why I'm pointing this out to you. As Nehemiah worked to restore the walls and to reestablish Jerusalem as a gathering place for God's people, Sanballat and his allies became very angry and agitated. And so it's written that all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. And our adversaries said, they will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. And so I want you to take note of the tactic, something that we see from the very beginning, something we see here used by Sanballat, and that is to get into the midst of God's people and then kill them and cause the work of God to cease. That is the adversary's tactic from the beginning. That's why he wanted to get into the midst of the garden. And so then, what does this have to do with the terror attack in New Orleans? Well, let's consider this. Interestingly, some biblical commentators suggest that the name Sanballat is derived from an Akkadian word that gives homage to the Sumerian moon god. And the moon god's name is Sin. And that means that Sanballat, his name, means sin gives life. The moon god gives life. Now, I don't want you to focus so much on the word sin because it doesn't connect in the way that you might suppose. Rather, I want you to consider that this infamous man who wanted to get into the midst of God's people, kill them, and cause the work of God to cease, was named after a false deity that was associated with the moon. And let's also consider that Nehemiah's response to the threat was not to go to sleep and give up, but it was to post sentries, to guard against what the enemy desired to do. In fact, as they continued rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, the Bible tells us that they did so with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other. So I want you to compare that response to how, as a nation, the United States have responded, at least recently, to the very real and viable threat that is coming from radical Islam. And the response, in my view, has been to ignore it or to make excuses for it, to go to sleep, in other words. Now, let's pivot from that to something else for just a moment. I want you to consider how many wars the nation of Israel has fought since becoming a nation in 1948 and against their neighbors in Egypt and Syria and Jordan, all these people. Consider that, and then consider how many of those wars they have actually lost. Well, the answer is 0. But now compare that to the damage that has been done to Israel when they've let their guard down to the enemy that dwells in their midst. For instance, through the different intifadas, because intifada, of course, according to some, is the solution. Or consider how much damage was done when they let their guard down in the years before October 7th of 2023, believing that somehow, some way, they could coexist with Hamas. So my point is, what happened in New Orleans is connected, philosophically at least, with what happened on September 11th of 2001, and what happened on October 7th of 2023, and what happened in the days of Nehemiah, which in turn is first revealed to us in Genesis chapter 3, when the serpent slithered into the midst of the garden with designs to steal, to kill, and to destroy. In other words, what we saw in New Orleans, what we saw on 9/11, is just a modern expression of an ancient hatred, and one that I fear will not dissipate as long as God's people continue to sleep. The biblical evidence for that is, in my view, overwhelming. But I want to share with you one passage that, in my opinion, really sets the stage for what we're talking about. And we go all the way back to Genesis, where the Bible, speaking of Ishmael, says this: "He shall be a wild man," and some translations render that as a wild donkey or a wild beast. And then it says, "His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence," literally in the face, "of all of his brethren." So here's what that passage really says. This is how it translates in my mind anyway. Ishmael and those descended from Ishmael are not going to be bound by widely accepted standards of behavior. He's going to be unpredictable in comparison to most. He's not going to be content to, shall we say, remain in his own field, but is going to insist on getting in the face of every other man and pick a fight with every other man, which is to say, to confront and to challenge everyone, and particularly his brethren, and then, and let's not miss this, to dwell in their midst. Now, still speaking of Ishmael, his second son, a man called Kedar, was the father of the Kedarites, which is, as I understand, a northern Arab tribe that lived in very close proximity to the Edomites, that is, the descendants of Esau. In fact, one of his sisters, that is Kedar, was the third wife of Esau. That's just something that's very important prophetically, and especially in the light of the words that we see in Psalm 83. And I'm not going to read that. You can look that up for yourself. But there is this alliance between the two. Now, back to Ishmael, back to Kedar. According to tradition, Kedar is the ancestor of the Quraysh tribe, and I probably mispronounced that. But this tribe, according to tradition, is the ancestor of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. In short, if tradition can be trusted, there is a direct link between Ishmael, think about the prophecy that we just read, there is a link between Ishmael and Muhammad. And if there is a link there, then there's a link between Ishmael and the followers of Islam, including those who have been radicalized. So again, what happened in New Orleans is just another example of what the entire world, every man, is what the prophecy said. That's what we're going to be facing in the days ahead. Is it coincidental, by the way, that New Orleans is called the Crescent City? Specifically, because someone considered the area's topography to resemble the crescent. Interesting. For that matter, is it coincidental that Las Vegas is called Sin City? Or is it that there are these little hints that tell us this is more than just what people make it to be? It's more than just what we see on the surface. In fact, maybe there are certain patterns that have been established long ago that continually frame events in our day and time. You're going to have a hard time convincing me that all these things that we see are just happenstance. I don't believe that New Orleans is an isolated incident, but it's one among others, past, present, and future. Things that are going to be repeated in this nation, things that are going to be repeated around the world, as long as radicalized individuals, whether they're Muslim or whether they're anarchists marching in the streets, as long as they are ignored and explained away, tolerated, these things are going to continue to happen. And so then what do you and I as believers do? Well, in my view, we should be like Nehemiah. We need to be aware that there are Sanballats out there who want desperately to infiltrate what God is doing in order to steal, to kill, and to destroy. They want to stop the work of God in your life, in my life, and in the body. They want to put an end to what God is doing in the world today. And so you and I have to be diligent to continue the work with a tool in one hand, and if need be, to be able to pivot and to fight and to guard with the weapon that we hold in the other. And of course, our weapon of choice is not the sword made with the hands of man, but with the sword of the Spirit and the Word of God. And so then, as Nehemiah encouraged the people of Judah, let's encourage one another with these words. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And let us believe that the Lord will guard and defend us, and that where our families are concerned, the enemy's plot will come to nothing, so that all of us can return to the wall and finish the work before us.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to get the latest updates from Bill, and check out other podcasts available from Jacob's Tent. And join us next week on The Weekly Scroll.